This is Lois Whaley for Women Today and Yesterday. We're just doing this show on January 20th, and of course this is the inauguration day. Tomorrow, the 21st, there's a big march scheduled in Washington, D.C. for women. I know quite a few folks who are going to that march. And there are going to be companion marches in a number of cities and towns around the whole country. I myself am planning to go to Chillicothe, which is, like about 50, 60 miles away from here. And the people who are going to the march, a number of them will be wearing a pink hat with a little corners on it, sort of like a kitty cat's hat. And it's my hat actually says 2017 Women's March. I got that from my friend Wenda Sheard, who made a whole bunch of them, which she's getting to people who are going, mostly to the folks who are going to Washington, D.C. The pin there that you see came out in 1995 to celebrate the 75th anniversary of women's suffrage, which was a long, hard fight and battle, obviously. Probably most people remember that it is as of 1848 that the first women's conference really was held. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was one of those pioneers, along with Lucretia Mott. And Lucretia Mott, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and also Carrie Chapman Catt, well, at least those three women, and Susan B. Anthony, probably the best known of all the women suffragists activists of the 19th century. That statue of the women who worked for the vote, the first pioneer women, is in the Capitol Rotunda in Washington, D.C. And all eyes today on January 20th are on Washington, D.C. because of the inauguration of Donald J. Trump as the President of the United States. As I speak, which is just after 11 o'clock on January 20th, we still have President Barack Obama, but for only one more hour, and then he will be history as president, and Mr. Trump will become our 45th, or is it 46th, president of the United States. Well, I'm going to be going into some more of that history, and because this is 2017, the new year, 2017, we've already had some interesting things occur, which I want to refer to. Namely, earlier of this week, we had Martin Luther King Jr. Day on Monday, because of his birthday being January the 16th. And actually this year, his birthday fell on the federal holiday, which is the, which happens to be the holiday on a Monday, because his birthday was actually on Sunday, but they celebrated the next day because that's the way to give people a nice 3-day weekend. I want to show something associated with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., namely a t-shirt that I have, which exemplifies how Black Lives Matter. And my t-shirt, who was given to me by my dear friend Judy Daso, shows well-known black activists over the years. I'll go down. Now, the way they have it, you see the large letters, those are things that this person was noted for. And then they, in most cases, give the first name and I will supply the last, okay? So the very first one up at the top, near the neck, says dream. Dream like Martin Luther King Jr. Next is lead. Lead like Harriet Tubman, who took so many slaves out of slavery during the slavery times in the early 19th century before the Civil War. Fight like Malcolm. And that was Malcolm X, who was an activist in the 1960s, a black activist in the 1960s who was assassinated at that time. Think is next. Think like Garvey. Now that is a last name. We're talking about Malcolm Garvey, who was the person who organized the transfer of a number of black former slaves to Africa. That was his idea, that would be a good idea, and that was what actually began the country of Liberia. Liberia, the name for freedom. That country was promoted by Garvey. Next it says write, and here we have a poet, a modern day poet. Write like Maya Angelou. Next is speak, no. Next is build, actually. Build like Madam C.J. Well, that's her first name, you might say, but her last name was Walker. Madam C.J. Walker was probably the first black millionaire. She made her money by developing and selling cosmetics specifically for black people, especially women. So that is Madam C.J. Walker. Speak. Speak like Frederick Douglass, born a slave who moved to the North, escaped slavery, and became a well-known proponent of abolition in the before the Civil War in particular, obviously, because the Civil War resulted eventually in the abolition of slavery. President Lincoln was the one who proclaimed the Proclamation of Emancipation on January 1st, 1863, during the war, in order to encourage black slaves to speak up and rise up and support the Union cause during the Civil War. Next is educate. Educate like W.E.B. W.E.B. Du Bois, or Dubois, as the French have it. And actually there's a little personal connection there, since I have Dubois ancestors who came to the New World, as we say sometimes, in 1660 and 1661 and settled in the Hudson Valley, the Dubois and Du Boises of Catskill. My great-great-grandmother was born Lana Dubois in Catskill, Ohio, and she later moved to Kansas. And at the end of her life, in 1913, she was in Hawaii. So her life epitomizes the westward movement of the United States. She was a Dubois, a very distant cousin of W.E.B. Du Bois, who was a black philosopher and educator. And at the very end of his life, when he was a very ancient gentleman, in his late 90s, he moved to the African state of Ghana. Believe like Thurgood, and that's for Thurgood Marshall, who was named to the Supreme Court. He was the first black person to be on the Supreme Court, Thurgood Marshall. And challenge. Here's someone that I can remember from the news of the 1950s. Rosa challenged, like Rosa Parks, who challenged segregation in 1955 by riding on a bus in the white section in Alabama, and so she became the challenger of segregation, Rosa Parks. So we've had an interesting number of events already this January, and now we're on to the current ones. Today's inauguration of President Donald Trump, and tomorrow's march on Washington. They're hoping for some hundreds, thousands of women to be at the March on Washington. And I might mention again that there is a nearby march which will be in Chillicothe starting at 12 noon on the 21st of January. So, and that's just tomorrow. So, very important things that have happened already, and I want to go back into history, some of my history actually. There's a picture of me, I'm 84 now. This picture was taken in the late 1970s, and I would point out that I'm wearing a t-shirt actually. I started my t-shirts way back in the 1970s, and that t-shirt says spanning. It was spanning the globe, and I am wearing my UNICEF button, the United Nations Children's Fund, because I was active with helping to get children out to collect money for UNICEF during the 1960s and 70s, along with some other folks here in Athens, Ohio. Mary Ann Simpson was the person who was already doing UNICEF when I came to town in 1964. And later we had Dr. Sushila Gawande as part of our UNICEF team. So what I'm going to do at this point is talk a little bit, actually for some time, about this book, which is shown, To Form a More Perfect Union. To Form a More Perfect Union was published in 1976 and was used to help guide the 56 state and of course there are 50 states, but in addition to the 50 states, there are some territories that the United States is involved with, like Puerto Rico. And there were 56 conferences that were held in 1977, exactly 40 years ago today, was the first meeting that I attended of the conference committee in Columbus, Ohio, and we made the plans for the conference that was held here in Ohio, June 11 and 12, 1977. The book, To Form a More Perfect Union, with the women's sign on it, the signal up there in the corner, you notice, is the IWY bird, the International Women's Year bird. Notice that the tail feathers are an equality sign, and there is the women's symbol about at the neck of the bird there, which is a circle with a cross under it. That's the traditional women's symbol. So to form a more perfect union is the way that our Constitution begins, you know. We, the people of the United States of America, in order to form a more perfect union, and goes on from there. I won't try to recite the whole thing, although I can remember as an 8th grader in 1945 that we memorized the preamble to the U.S. Constitution, and I imagine that there are a number of school children today who still do that when they study American history and government and civics. Well, To Form a More Perfect Union book was, as I mentioned, actually printed in 1976, the year before all these 56 conferences were held. And so it obviously needed to be done beforehand. Why? Because actually in 1971-72, the United Nations was talking about how to celebrate the 30th anniversary of the founding of the United Nations in 1945. They were thinking ahead to 1975. And so they set up a conference for women worldwide, organized by the United Nations, and it was held in our part of the world. It was held in Mexico City in July of 1975, late June and early July of 1975. And then the whole idea was to bring some of the things that had been discussed at the conference to the attention of all the countries in the world. And in the United States, that was under the Secretary of State's office. The State Department was the one who developed this book, To Form a More Perfect Union. My copy is sort of battered because I got it back then. I got it in 1976. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that by reading about a paper that I wrote from about the Ohio International Women's Year meeting held 11th and 12th June 1977, which is an essay and memoir which I wrote for Dr. Catherine Jellison when I was working for a Master of Social Science degree at Ohio University. First, I want to tell you a little bit about the background of the Ohio International Women's Year meeting and the connections with our own locality. There was a very close connection, as it turned out, with our own locality, because our congressman at the time, Clarence E. Miller of Lancaster, who would continue to serve from 1966 to 1992, when that's 13 terms in the House of Representatives, when he lost the election in 1992 because they had to get rid of one congressional seat. In fact, I think I refer to that in this paper that I'm going to read from. Background to the Ohio International Women's Year meeting of 1977. In December 1972, the United Nations General Assembly called for the first large international women's meeting, which would be held in Mexico City in 1975. So, the 30th anniversary of the founding of the United Nations was celebrated around the world as International Women's Year and the beginning of the International Decade of Women. President Richard Nixon proclaimed International Women's Year in the United States in January 1974. And in January 1975, President Gerald Ford named 35 members to a national commission to plan an observance of IWY for 1976, the year, of course, of the bicentennial of the U.S. Declaration of Independence of 1776. Early in the United States, in the 1970s, interest in women's rights and women's issues was generally strong, and women's rights were receiving bipartisan support. In 1971, on one of the first occasions in 48 years that an equal rights amendment was voted out of congressional committee, the U.S. House of Representatives passed it by the required 2/3 vote. Then in spring of 1972, the Senate came up with the necessary vote, and the Equal Rights Amendment, often called the ERA, was sent to the states. Passage by 38 states was provided that educational institutions receive federal funds. Whoops, looks like I missed something here. Passage of 38 states needed for ratification of the Equal Rights Amendment. And that same year, in 1972, Title IX of the Education Amendments provided that educational institutions receiving federal funds should not discriminate on the basis of sex. On 22 January 1973, the Supreme Court announced the Roe v. Wade decision permitting abortion with rules varying according to the trimesters within the 9 months of pregnancy. All three of these actions were taken during Nixon's presidency. A backlash against the ERA, Title IX, and Roe v. Wade soon erupted. A right to life of the fetus and limits on women's reproductive decisions were championed by the Roman Catholic, Mormon, and conservative Protestant denominations against abortion. College sports fans perceived Title IX as a particular threat to football, and after quick acceptance of the Equal Rights Amendment by many states, the pace slowed. They had to get to 38 in order to put the Equal Rights Amendment in the Constitution. Ohio, at 33rd to ratify, which was on 7th of February 1974, was almost the last state to take such action. In April 1975, shortly after finishing a master's degree in political science, called government in those days, I became president of the Athens League of Women Voters. About the same time, I was also named legislative or public policy chairman for the Athens branch of the American Association of University Women, often called AAUW. A longtime supporter of the United Nations, I noted media reports from the International Women's Year meeting, which was held 19th June to 2 July 1975 in Mexico City. And soon I began lobbying for follow-up national and state meetings promoting the International Women's Year goals. Congressman Miller's opposition to funding the IWY meetings in 1976 is my next chapter here. Our 10th District Congressman was Clarence E. Miller, a Republican born in Fairfield County in 1917 and an electrical engineer with Columbus and Southern Ohio Electric Company. After serving as a Lancaster City councilman and mayor, he was elected to Congress in 1966. And actually, in 1972, my husband, Robert H. Whaley, ran against Miller. He was a supporter of the Democratic candidate for president, George McGovern. Like other Democrats, 1968 to 1990, Bob Whaley was overwhelmingly defeated, garnering only 25% of the November 1972 vote to Miller's 75%. Mr. Miller was a fiscal conservative noted for excellent constituent service to veterans, black lung victims, and so on, and many Democrats and independents voted for him. He would only lose his place in Congress when the 10th District had to be relocated after Ohio lost 2 congressional seats following the 1990 census. Clarence Miller was not noted for activity on the House floor. In fact, Here's a quote from Roll Call. In 1990, Roll Call, the newspaper covering Capitol Hill, declared Clarence Miller chairman of the Caucus of the Obscure in a piece profiling the most unknown members. But in the 1970s, he received a modicum of fame with his 5% bill, consistently proposing amendments to spending bills to reduce them by 5%. But in 1976, too, Congressman Miller played the major role in the last-ditch effort in the House of Representatives to halt financial support for the observance of International Women's Year. Miller had voted in 1971 for the Equal Rights Amendment, a vote many of his conservative supporters viewed as a terrible mistake. Ohio Right to Life and Ohio Eagle Forum, in particular, would let him know their views in opposition to the ERA and to the IWY meetings. About March 1976, Miller even begged people to stop inundating Congress with male-opposing day care, which was one of the social services promoted by International Women's Year, as a communist plot. A member of the Appropriations Committee of the House, Miller would become an outspoken opponent of funding for the proposed 56 state and territorial IWY women's meetings and the culminating National Women's Conference. All these meetings were expected to consider the Mexico City Plan of Action and the Equal Rights Amendment, currently before the states. On 20th of October 1975, Mr. Miller began his activities, and I'm going to spare you most of this, which does talk about specific title of the bill and all this kind of thing. But there was an emergency measure funding for the U.S. IWY observance. Although it got a majority, this bill failed for lack of a two-thirds vote. They needed a two-thirds vote. Another straw in the wind flew by at the 4 November 1975 election. New York and New Jersey, considered bastions of liberalism, rejected state equal rights amendments proposals due to a well-organized opposition by conservatives. And it was at that time, in 1975, that I first wrote to Congressman Miller in the name of the Athens branch of AAUW, asking his support for passage of the funding for the International Women's Year meetings. But fears were expressed in debate that meetings would provide forums to promote the Equal Rights Amendment and abortion. Miller voted no on both the committee and on the floor. That was in '75. But the Senate passed the bill unchanged on 11 December 1975 on a voice vote. And just before Christmas 1975, an International Women's Year was drawing to its close. President Ford signed the authorization measure, which provided for authorizing money to have the 56 state and territorial conferences. The next hurdle was actually appropriating money for the women's meetings. Funding for the meetings was first proposed at $10 million for these 56 meetings. But it was halved to $5 million, which Representatives Bella Abzug, Democrat of New York, and Patsy Mink, Democrat of Hawaii, saw as bare bones for setting up these 56 meetings in the national conference. And I wrote again to Congressman Miller for the Athens League of Women Voters, of which I was president at the time, in March of 1976, asking him to support the funding, which at, quote, less than 1 cent per woman in the U.S. would enable the holding of the grassroots state meetings, quote, as a tremendous contribution to the bicentennial celebrations, end quote. He responded that, quote, those who wish to work for women's rights should do so, but I feel their efforts should not be underwritten by the U.S. Treasury when this country is running a deficit of $72 billion. End of quote from Congressman Miller's letter in March of '76. So, at the time the appropriations bill was debated on the 13th of April 1976, Congressman Miller offered an amendment on the floor of the House to cut all funding for a national commission on the observance of International Women's Year 1975. He referred to many ladies contacting him and other members in fear that the meeting funding might be used to lobby for the Equal Rights Amendment and somehow to encourage legislation for abortion. Miller quoted a resolution passed on 15th of April 1975 by the Commission promoting ratifications of the Equal Rights Amendment. He said nothing about financial reasons for opposing the IWY meetings at that time. Opposition to Miller's amendment was strongly voiced by Representatives Mink and Margaret Heckler, Republican of Massachusetts. Heckler, who had served on the U.S. Commission for IWY in 1975, pointed out that the proposed National Women's Conference was, quote, supported by a broad coalition of women's organizations, the League of Women Voters, American Association of University Women, Business and Professional Women, National Women's Political Caucus, International Women's Garment Workers Union, National Association on the Status of Women, and many, many others. Allegations of ERA lobbying are totally false, Ms. Heckler said. However, the whole commission of heretofore strangers agreed that passage of the Equal Rights Amendment was the commission's first priority. Men who rose to support the Congresswoman included Edward Koch, Democrat of New York, and Spark Matsunaga, Democrat of Hawaii, who claimed it would be the first, and as it turned out, the last, truly national women's meeting ever held in the U.S. in 200 years. Patricia Schroeder, Democrat of Colorado, also opposed Miller's amendment, and Joseph Adabo, Democrat of New York, of the House Appropriations Committee, pointed out that the authorization had already been fully debated and the budgeted $5 million would provide grants to aid people to attend. When it appeared clear that Miller's amendment would be defeated, he called for a quorum count, a standard delaying maneuver in parliamentary procedure for the 435-member House of Representatives. Only 80 members were present on the House floor, but when 20 more showed up, the quorum call was vacated and Miller's amendment was voted down. However, he immediately moved a new amendment to insert these words, quote, provided that none of the funds shall be used for the purpose of directly or indirectly influencing the passage or defeat of any piece of legislation before any legislative body, including the ratification of any constitutional amendment, end quote. Congressman Mahon and Steed praised Miller's new amendment, which was agreed to by the House. The final vote was 352 yea, 35 nay, including Ashbrook, Hayes, and Miller of Ohio, and 45 not voting, including Congresswoman Abzug. Later in April, AAUW informed me of the key role Congressman Miller had taken in imposing funding for the women's meetings. It also began to appear that the Senate, which in December had routinely passed the House authorization of the Women's Conference bill on a voice vote, would raise objections to appropriations for its funding. In early May, I attended the League of Women Voters of the U.S. National Convention, held in New York City, where Mildred Marcy addressed the delegates. As the IWY coordinator at the Department of State, she summarized the Mexico City meeting and the activities of the National Commission on the Observance of International Women's Year 1975. Marcy referred to the Miller Amendment in her lengthy talk, and I spoke with her about it afterwards. This book, To Form a More Perfect Union, was sent to me by Miss Mildred Miller, pardon me, and it's addressed to Mrs. Lois D. Whaley, President, League of Women Voters, 14 Oak Street, Athens, Ohio, 45701. I'm reading from the address. That's why this is such a battered piece of book. Immediately upon returning home to Athens, this was in May of 1976, I got together an ad hoc committee including members of AAUW, BPW, League of Women Voters, now the National Organization for Women, and Common Cause. We met at United Campus Ministry, I recall, to discuss Congressman Miller's leadership in opposing funding for the IWY meetings. Women reporters who attended that meeting wrote articles published in the OU Post and the Athens Messenger. That was before the days of the A-News, incidentally. Meanwhile, on May 11th, the Senate took up the House-passed bill. Senator Jesse Helms, Republican of North Carolina, led the attack, putting in the record correspondence from Phyllis Schlafly, who recently passed away, actually. Phyllis Schlafly was president of the 42,000-member conservative women's group, Eagle Forum. In a cliffhanger action by a Senate vote of 46 yay to 45 nay, the Senate set funding at $5 million, although the Senate committee had recommended only $3 million. After the conference committee met on May 19th, the House and Senate passed the IWY bill at $5 million without the Miller wording. Ohio Senators John Glenn, Democrat, and Robert Taft, Republican, both voted for the bill, which was signed by President Ford. The following day, May 20th, 1976, an ad hoc delegation of women waited on Congressman Miller's representative, Kit Custer, during his regular Athens visit to voice our opposition to Miller's actions. In an interview with an OU Post reporter, Miller said he was opposed to money for lobbying. This prompted a letter to the Post, published June 1st, responding to Miller's references to having received 2 feet of mail opposing the women's meetings. The Athens Women's Letter pointed out that at an estimated 100 postcards to the inch, that is 2,400 postcards out of a district of 450,000 people. If one person of every 8 in Athens, just all by itself, were to write favoring the National Women's Conference, that would be more than 2,400 postcards. Think about it. Whatever the issue, the congressman, and Mr. Congressman Miller in particular, needs to hear from his constituents, and volume of mail does make a difference. In May and June, I contacted more than a dozen nearby leagues and AAUW branches, suggesting that they, like Athens, act in coalition with other groups. We might thereby stir up letters and cards to our congressmen and senators to support the women's meetings. On the 14th of June, I also wrote to Mildred Marcy at the State Department, including the press clippings and correspondence from May and June. She responded, quote, "Thanks to efforts such as yours, The Miller Amendment, as you know, was deleted from the final bill. She mentioned that the 1975 IWY Commission's final report was at the printer. And that was how I received my copy of To Form a More Perfect Union, Justice for American Women, 1976 publication. This 382-page report would serve as a guide for the 56 meetings and national conference to be held in 1977. During the summer of 1976, excitement in the U.S. ran high, but not because of women's meetings. Half a decade of anticipation of the bicentennial of the Declaration of Independence culminated in a glorious 4th. Since 1976 was a presidential election year, the U.S. political picture was in a state of flux. Republican Ronald Reagan was challenging incumbent Republican President Ford. Representatives Abzug and Mink gave up safe seats in the U.S. House of Representatives to run for the U.S. Senate, but both lost in their primary elections. Then, once the party conventions were held, presidential campaigning began in earnest. During this excitement, International Women's Year asked Mary E. Miller of the Women's Ohio Volunteer Employment Network, or WOVEN, to supply IWY with names for a committee to plan the Ohio Women's Meeting. She sent them about 150 names. Change from a Republican to a Democratic administration became clear when Jimmy Carter was elected in November 1976. Gerald Ford would retire as president on 20th of January 1977, which is exactly 40 years ago today, because today is 20th of January 2017, and President-elect Donald Trump in just a few minutes is going to become President of the United States, since January 20th, of course, is the time when new presidents take office. It's been like that since 1933. Before that, it was as late as March 4th. It was March 4th in the original Constitution, and they felt that was pretty long time between Election Day in November and then March before the new president came to office. So it's now January 20th. Well, at a later time, I will go into some of the specifics of what happened in 1976 when the committee met with Mary E. Miller as the chairwoman of the conference in Ohio. This book, which is in even more battered shape than my copy of To Form a More Perfect Union, this book is the report of the Ohio Women's Meeting that was held in Ohio on June 11th and 12th, 1977 at the Columbus Fairgrounds, the state fairgrounds in Columbus, and it was a very interesting meeting. I was named to the committee to plan for the meeting. I was named by, presumably by President Carter, because I was named late in January, and Ohio was one of the very last states to set up a committee to work on International Women's Year. I mentioned Mary Miller, Mary E. Miller, a Portsmouth native, so a neighbor, you might say, here in southeast Ohio, who chaired the committee which set up the Ohio meeting in June of 1977. Mrs. Miller was quite a well-organized person. She later, in 1978, was one of the moving spirits to the setting up of the Ohio Women Incorporated group, now shrunk to a rather small committee, but one of which I have been a member for almost 20 years and still serve as its secretary for Ohio Women Incorporated. So those are some of the events which are going to be coming up here. Let me, in the time that I have remaining, which I'm not sure just how long it is, could you give me an idea, Matt? Hey, I've got plenty of time. I will bring up some other things of interest here. First, to talk a little bit more about the history of women's suffrage. I mentioned the 1948 meeting, which of course is the most famous of the meetings where the idea of women voting, that's what suffrage means, is voting, was first actually passed, very narrowly, I might add. They were interested in other rights for women that were not there at the time. But they narrowly passed at Elizabeth Cady Stanton's urging, and she was the one who wrote it up, the decision to also press for women to have the right to vote, with the idea that if you can't vote for your government, then somebody else is definitely making all the decisions. It's not part of your responsibility. Well, you know, actually one of the very next meetings was this bag celebrates its 150th time. It was held in Salem, Ohio in 1850. In 1850, and is often considered the second, especially in Ohio, is considered the second really large women's rights convention in the United States. I got that bag when I went up in 2000 to the 150th anniversary of the Salem meeting. Now, here is my sash, which gives the, there's a picture of it there. This I wore particularly in 2009 at our Ohio Women Incorporated meeting at the State House in Columbus. And let me read you some of these buttons. Well, here's up at the top on one side we have Appalachian Women's Caravan, which was in 1994. Then we have I have here a button for the League of Women Voters. I'm a life member of the League of Women Voters, and in fact don't have to pay dues anymore because I've been a member for over 50 years. Now here's a nice button. I think we had this at the 2009 meeting. It says, "Let Ohio Women Vote," and it shows a picture of a woman in front of the Great Seal of Ohio, which you know actually has the mountains in the background are mountains near Chillicothe, because Chillicothe was the first capital of Ohio before Columbus. And I see here the arrows and the sheaf of wheat, which is featured on the Great Seal of Ohio in the background of this. And then it has a very handsome woman saying, "Let Ohio Women Vote." Now the next button shows Alice Paul. Alice Paul was a founder of the Women's Party. The Women's Party was just last spring, named as a national monument by President Barack Obama. The headquarters of the Women's Party, which is now a museum in Washington, D.C., was the actual site of this monument, and honors Alice Paul and other women who supported the Women's Party. She is credited, as I mentioned earlier, with the wording of the Equal Rights Amendment, which is only 23 words long. Equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. That's the complete text of the Equal Rights Amendment, which, of course, was never ratified by 38 states. It was ratified by 36 states, but it never reached 38. And later this year, I will tell you about the interesting event that we had here in Athens in 1982, when the Equal Rights Amendment, quote, failed because it did not meet the time limit that was set for it. Now, there are a lot of people who say that that could be done differently, but right now that's the case, and it was in 1982 when we had the day after the Equal Rights Amendment, which was July 1, 1982, because the time limit for passage of the Equal Rights Amendment expired in June 30th, 1982. Well, back to the next button is Eleanor Roosevelt. I remember Mrs. Roosevelt quite well, since I was born in 1932, just a week or two before her husband, who was governor of New York State, was named to be the candidate for the Democratic Party, and was elected, of course, in November of 1932, and inaugurated on March 4th, 1933, because he was the last person under the old date for presidents taking office. Eleanor Roosevelt. Words to remember her by. Nobody can make you feel inferior without your consent. Also, there is no such thing as being a bystander. And life was meant to be lived. Good words to remember from Eleanor Roosevelt. And then I have a nice pin that was given to me by the League of Women Voters when they honored me in, I guess it was 2002 or 2000. Well, there are more buttons on the other side, and since I think we have some more time, I will mention some of these too. I'm not being able to go to the March on Washington tomorrow on January 21st, 2017, but I did go to a women's march in April of 2004, which is over 10 years ago now, 12 years ago plus. This was March for Freedom of Choice on terminating a pregnancy. And that was quite a big march. I remember seeing a newspaper picture of it showing Pennsylvania Avenue all filled with mostly women, but plenty of men too, for that march in April of 2004. Now the next button shows Sojourner Truth. Sojourner Truth was the one who saved the women's meeting that was held in Ohio in 1853, she saved the day because they were having this women's meeting, which was sort of taken over by the men who came to the meeting as well. And she saved that and became famous. She's still known for the speech she gave there that supported the women. She was a former slave, but not in the South. She was from New York State. Well, these also, we have the Power of One Voice, which is an AAUW button. We have Hillary Clinton's button from 2008 when she ran the first time. We have a Use Your Vote button, just like the one that I think Matt has there. Use your vote, yes, indeed. And we have a women's campaign button for Carol Moseley Braun, who was a U.S. Senator from the state of Illinois. And finally, a button pro-child, pro-family, pro-choice, which is my stand on reproductive rights. So, this is Lois Whaley, and I've been talking this hour about women of the past, women myself included, and we have a picture of me from way back when, which I think Matt also showed. There I am wearing a t-shirt from the late 1970s at the time, or just after when I had worked for the International Women's Year Conference held in June of 1977, 40 years ago. This is Lois Whaley for Women Today and Yesterday.